everyone. My name is Julie Farkas. I'm the director of the Novi Library. I'm very excited to see all of you here this evening, especially with it being a Friday night. It's dark, it's cold. I think that's the beginning of a good novel, but you chose to be here tonight on a Friday night, and that makes me, as a library director, feel really good about what we're doing, and hopefully you will completely enjoy the next hour with what you hear, and hopefully with what you experience. I have a few thank yous. I always have to start with that because an event like this can't be done without lots of help and support. So we obviously have changed things up a little bit this year. We are on a Friday night. You all received some information as you walked in, and you got a drink ticket to have some wine with us afterwards and some desserts. Thanks to Stephen Rockies here in town. So enjoy after you leave and walk out at 8 o'clock tonight. Enjoy a glass of wine, and hopefully you'll stick around for a little bit. You get a chance to talk to our author, get a book signed if you are interested and if you want to purchase one. And then we do have some tables with information from the libraries that are here too. So we hope you'll enjoy this experience. On your chair, you will find a small token of our appreciation, which is for supporting the Neighborhood Library Association. That is a group of 6 libraries that are working together. Also, there is a piece of paper, a flyer, about last year we started an opportunity between us 6 libraries to collect books. And this year's initiative is called the Little Library. There is, I don't know if you've seen in communities, small little libraries that have been built. They look like tiny little houses. They're popping up everywhere. The Children's Hospital of Detroit, DMC, put one in almost a year ago. And we unfortunately lost a librarian here at Novi Library. And that little library was put in the hospital in honor and in memory of her. And they called me not long ago and asked if us libraries in this community would help keep it going. They were finding that with so many children visiting the hospital that they were running out of those books very quickly. So if you are in the mood to give and support this year, November 10th tonight through January 10th, all of our libraries locally will be accepting donations of gently used and new children's books and teen books so that they can be placed in that little library at the Children's Hospital. And you will definitely be keeping some young children reading and maybe some other things off their mind as well. So hopefully you will join us by doing that. We have a box here at our library. We just put it out tonight. It will be with our Christmas tree once we get it put up, but it is in the lobby, and I know the other libraries will be putting up a box as well to do some collections. So we welcome you to help us with that. This is our 8th annual community read. I don't know, ladies, how we do it, but we rock every year. I'm going to just pat ourselves right now on the back because sometimes you never thank you. Sometimes you just never know how something's going to go. You know, will it take off? Will it be of interest? And I think to have 8 years running is a pretty good run of opportunities to be bringing great books to our community. So I want to thank the libraries of Northville, Salem-South Lyon District Library, Lyon Township Library, Walled Lake Library, Wixom Library for being partners with the Novi Library and bringing this community read to all of our communities. A community read is an opportunity for us to read one book, have a great discussion, wrap some programming around it, and then, in our case, bring that author in and let you have an opportunity to read, but also meet and hear from that artist. And so we've been able to do that tonight. And we will be listening to Ben Winters and the Underground Airlines. Libraries, if you ask me, are truly transforming. I have had the privilege of being in Novi for 10 years, coming up on Sunday. And what I think is pretty amazing is the fact that we've gone beyond books and we have really become community gathering places for our community, and we've allowed people to have great conversations and learn things new. The motto here at Novi is inform, inspire, include. I live by that every day because it's 3 words that make perfect sense to what I hope all of us libraries are doing for all of you. So we're really excited when we can do that and go beyond the book. We love the book, but we like to go a little beyond it sometimes. At this time, I want to recognize the people that I call my partners in crime. And those are the library directors that have been working so close together in order to do this. And so Julie Heron from the Northville District Library. Donna Olson, which unfortunately she's got an ankle issue and she's not here tonight, but Donna Olson from Salem-South Lyon District Library. Holly Teasdale from the Lyon Township Library. Andrea Dixon from Wixom Public Library. And Allison Lobert from Walled Lake City Library. And now I also can't go any further without thanking the committee that also is helping us as directors put this event together. And those amazing people to help find that perfect read and promote the event are Jesse Shank. Where's Jesse? Stand up, there you go. Christina Salvatore in the back. Michelle Fields. Carla Gibson. Perry Phil. Dee Beaver. Brenda Kligza. And Bethany Bratney from the Novi Community School District, who opened her doors this morning and let over 50 students hear Ben at the high school today, which was really, really cool. And then Dominic Dute from my IT department, who is taping us. So be good, everybody. Okay, but tonight truly wouldn't be what it is if it weren't for our friends of libraries. These are the groups that work very closely with our libraries to support and advocate what we do on a regular basis. They are you. They are community members that have helped us, monetarily, marketing-wise. They have done so much for us, publicity and everything, to make our events happen. And we could not be having authors like this come into our community if it weren't for our friends. So if you are looking for an opportunity to get involved and volunteer at your public libraries, please think of the Friends as one way to get involved with our libraries. They are amazing and they do just such fantastic things. So thanks to the Friends of all of our libraries in our communities. We truly appreciate their generous support. And finally, two more thank yous. One to the Baronet, because our author has a place to put his head down on a pillow. Thanks to them, and giving accommodations to Ben, and Barnes & Noble for providing the books this evening, and Maizano's Italian Restaurant for letting us have dinner there. We got to have dinner with the author. Sorry, everybody. That's the perk of being on the committee, right? Okay, so since August, 868 people have read this book. And I think that is just amazing that we can wrap around a title and get people excited about reading. In addition to that, we had tons of programs and opportunities where we could just, embrace an opportunity for a good read and then explore it even further. So now at this time, I am very excited to introduce you all to Ben Winters. Ben Winters is the author of 9 novels, including most recently the New York Times best-selling Underground Airlines. His other works include the award-winning Last Policeman trilogy, which concluded in 2014 with World of Trouble, a nominee for an Anthony Award and an Edgar Award from the Mystery Writers of America. Countdown City was an NPR Best Book of 2013 and the winner of the Philip K. Dick Award for Distinguished Science Fiction, a Macavity Award nomination, and an Anthony Award nomination, along with placement in numerous best of lists, including on Amazon, Slate, and NPR. Ben has also written extensively for the theater and was a 2009-10 Fellow of the Dramatists Guild. Ben's journalism has appeared in the Chicago Reader, The Nation, In These Times, USA Today, The Huffington Post, just to name a few. I'm always excited as a librarian to read reviews. So, Booklist says, a daring and very well constructed novel. Washington Post. The novel succeeds so well in part because its fiction is disturbingly close to our present reality. Winters has written a book that will make you see the world in a new light. Library Journal, it was a starred review, explosive, well plotted, and impossible to put down. This alt hist by the Edgar Award-winning author of the Last Policeman trilogy will attract readers of all genres. Fast-paced and filled with menace, the story has an ambiance that makes it special. And finally, James Patterson. He says, "It is a rare thing when a writer has a fresh, new, provocative idea and then executes it beautifully. This is what Ben H. Winters has done in his novel, Underground Airlines. Imagine an America in which slavery still exists. Now imagine a dramatic telling of the story." Ben grew up in Maryland. He went to college at Washington University in St. Louis. He has lived all over the place and has had many experiences. He's now in California with his wife and his 3 children. But tonight, Novi, Michigan, gets Ben Winters all to ourselves. It is my pleasure to introduce you all to Ben Winters. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really nice. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the library and libraries for having me. This is such a treat, and it's an honor to be here. That was a really nice introduction. It's embarrassing. I'm embarrassed. And yes, okay, so this is my most recent book, Underground Airlines. I presume that many of you have read it. Tell me, raise your hand if you haven't read it. Be honest. Okay, that's okay. I'll try not to ruin anything in case you still want to read it. There's time. But I will just, what I thought I would do this evening is I'll set up what the book is about, and I'll read a little bit, just a little bit, to give you a sense of the novel, and then I'll talk a little bit about how I came to write the book, sort of what the inspiration was for it, and what it means to me, and then I will see if anyone has any questions. And then if you don't, we can all just get to the wine, which I understand is a new part of this program, and everyone's very excited about it. Or I can read more, or we can sort of play it by ear from there. So, as you heard from the reviews, and those of you who've read it know, this is quite a high concept premise book. It is a detective novel, it's a thriller, but it's one that is set in an alternate version of reality, of our current reality. So it's set in America in the present day, except in my version of America, where the novel takes place, Civil War never happened. Lincoln was assassinated before he could be inaugurated. He was assassinated in 1861 in Indianapolis on the way from Springfield to Washington. The Civil War was averted by compromise, and the Civil War had been averted by compromise previous to that. And as I play out the premise of bits and pieces over the course of the book, we learned that it had been averted several times since then, and it is now the current day. Slavery still exists in 4 southern states: Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and a combined Carolinas that are just called Carolina. The hero of the book is very much what we call an anti-hero. A good conversation about that this morning with the high school students, because he starts out very much a bad guy, and he is himself a former enslaved person who now works undercover as an enforcer of the fugitive slave law, which we all remember from our American history was a real thing, which is in fact written into the Constitution, providing that slaves, even if they managed to escape their servitude and make it to the North, under federal law, it was required that they be hunted down and returned. And it was the U.S. Marshal Service that discharged that mission, although the text of the law said that all good citizens had a responsibility to participate in that. So the book imagines that the fugitive slave law has been sort of updated and remains in force, and my hero works undercover as an enforcer of it. So, as we can tell, the novel is not only high concept in the sense of being, whoa, what a cool concept, but high concept in that it is intentionally provocative. It was my intention for this not to be a book that is merely a thriller or mystery novel with a cool, interesting backdrop, but rather a novel that uses the archetype of a mystery novel, the sort of shape of a traditional thriller, to ask of the very important questions about the world that we live in. And in fact, I would count this novel to be a failure if you came away from it, if you read it and then put it down and were like, oh, that was really awesome, what a great story. I really enjoyed following the adventures of that character. I think the novel would be, if it were successful only in that sense, it would be a failure, because it would not be worth creating this version of America that I created if it didn't ask the reader, or if the reader wasn't challenged to think about what it means and the ways in which it is different from the actual America in which we live, and the ways in which it is distressingly similar. And that, in the end, is what the book is about. It's about the ways, and I'm getting ahead of myself. I was going to say all this later. I don't know why. Anyway, that in the end becomes this sort of raison d'etre of the novel. That's the point of it. It's the theme, is how we are as a nation still under the shadow of slavery. How we are still, in so many ways, tangled up in the legacy of those centuries. Because, and I think that, again, I talked about this with a high school student this morning, that we, I won't say we, that too many of us, and I think that even growing up, this is the way that our history is presented to us, or how we like to think of our history, is that we went through this time where we were bad. And then, after 1863, we became good, right? Or we think of it as, well, we were bad, and then after Johnson and the Civil Rights Act of 1965, we were good. Or we got good in 2008 when we elected a black president. And we could say, well, we've left all of that racism behind. And I think that, and I can talk more, and I will, about how I got to this idea, but that that's all wrong. You know what I mean? That it's reductive and it's simplistic, and it ignores all of the many, many ways that the legacy of slavery is still with us. In lots of different ways. Just for starters, in the fact that in the periods in which this nation was being sort of established and growing, and assets, wealth was being formed. There was a huge population in the country that was entirely locked out of that, and that didn't change overnight. And that in the years after slavery, institutions of policing and of incarceration were being established and grew directly out of institutions that had still existed before slavery. None of that necessarily changed. Even just if you think that it's something we should be proud of as a nation, that we have a continuous legislature that has been in session since the beginning. That is the same, those are the same bodies, the same institutions. That we never had a violent revolution in this country where we did away with all the old forms and brought in new forms. We're still living in the same place. And so the idea of the book then, I guess, was to sort of collapse history, right? And say, what if, instead of thinking of it as, which I started to think, in a way, slavery is still with us. To say, slavery is still with us, right? It's the difference between, for any of you remember from English class, from composition, the difference between a simile and a plain metaphor. The simile is like we are living now as if there is still slavery versus there is still slavery. A plain metaphor is, instead of saying he is like a rock, you say he is a rock, right? So it's, So that was the idea of the book. And whether it's successful or not, I don't know. But it's important to me, and I've tried to say it as many times as I could when I talk about the book, is that it is not intended as a thriller with this very provocative backdrop, but rather I'm using my, what I know about how to write a thriller as a way in to thinking about something that matters deeply. Okay, having said all that, relatively coherently, I hope. I'm going to read just briefly from the book, and this is a passage early on where that anti-hero who is undercover in Indianapolis, where, by the way, I was living when I wrote this book. I lived in Indy for about 3 years, and we actually came to South Haven for the summer, and he's just describing what it's like and what he's got with him. He's on the hunt. I had with me in Indianapolis all my usual equipment. Some of it was in my room at the Capital City Crossroads. Some of it was stashed in the trunk of the car. A variety of costume pieces, some wigs, some fake jewelry, and various basic elements of facial camouflage. A tube of spirit gum, a few shades of foundation, an eyebrow pencil. I had 6 different pairs of clear glass spectacles and 6 different sets of colored contact lenses. Other tools too. A set of picks and rakes for cracking locks, plus a backup set. Lanyards with name tags, fake badges and fake badge holders. Clothes and shoes. My phone and its charger and its various accessories. A computer. Paperwork for Jim Dirksen, and 3 more complete sets on 3 other names, all of it comprehensively backstopped, every phone number connected to a real phone, a real person who knew what to say if somebody called. Cash too, of course. Rolls of bills and rubber bands, available for my use for incidental expenses, all of which were to be reported at the completion of each assignment. I had a gun, but it stayed in the hotel. Almost all the time, that's where I kept it. I am an undercover operative in a dangerous line of work, but understand that I am also an African-American male living in the United States of America. There are going to be checkpoints. I am going to get stopped. Every once in a while, I'm going to have to dump out my bag under the watchful eye of some kind of lawman, sheriff's deputy, patrol officer, state trooper, what have you. Might just be some shopping center wage slave shithead rolling up on his Segway, flashing his costume shop tin, wanting to prove his cock size to the girl at the sunglasses kiosk. When that sort of BS happened, I had no choice but to submit. I had no badge, no ID. I was true undercover right down the line. If you saw the way I traveled, if you went through my suitcase or the trunk of my car, you'd think I was a thief, some kind of con man. Which I was, of course. Really, that's exactly what I was. I was a thief. I was some kind of con man. Okay. That's enough for now. So, let me talk just for a moment about how I came to write this book. And I sort of already said a little bit of this, but I'll back up. So the previous books that I had written, prominent among them, was this trilogy. The first one of which was called The Last Policeman. And I've written a bunch of stuff before that, with kids stuff and some sort of more silly stuff. And The Last Policeman was the first book I wrote that I felt like really reflected who I am as a writer. And it's a detective novel, and it's a very high concept detective novel. It takes place in Concord, New Hampshire, in the 9 months before an asteroid the size of the one that killed the dinosaurs hits the planet. So, basically, it's a pre-apocalyptic noir. It's about what life on Earth is like during this time period before the world ends, particularly from the point of view of my main character, who is a young police detective who, despite the fact that civilization is sort of unwinding around him, is going about his business, which happens to be solving murders. And it started out, that book, basically as like a high concept. I was like, I really want to write a detective novel. What would be a really cool detective novel? What would be an awesome way to do this that we've never seen before? I've got it, I know. The world's about to end. But my hero doesn't care. He's just doing his thing. It's like, that's cool. And I pitched it to a publisher and they were like, great, we love it. But so it came very much from that plot level, that sort of surface level. Wouldn't this be a neat thing? Almost like you could just picture the poster, you know what I mean? But as soon as I started writing it, and then I realized it was going to be a trilogy, and the further I got into it, I was like, wait a second. This book is actually about something much more sort of rich. It's about the fact that, spoiler alert, we're all going to die one day, right? There's an asteroid of one shape or another coming for all of us. So how do we organize our lives? Why do we do the things that we do? Why do some of us work really hard in our jobs and keep to our commitments? And why do some people do the equivalent of like bucket list stuff and run around and never settle down and like, oh, I'm going to die anyway, what do I care, you know? And so the more that I worked on the book, the more sort of it became a more philosophical piece. And it remained a detective novel and the sort of twists and turns and all that stuff. But I sort of stumbled onto what I really wanted to do, right? What I think is sort of my thing. It's a great word. My sort of calling as an author, which is to use that form, that sort of traditional shape of a mystery novel, but to use it to kind of dig into something that is hopefully a little more challenging, a little more interesting, and it asks the reader to be thoughtful about their own lives and about the world. So I wrote those 3 novels, and they did relatively well for me. It was a kind of a breakthrough in terms of my career and that sort of sense of who I was as an author. And meanwhile, as a human being, sort of outside of my office, as an American, walking around, as a white person, I was confronted and continue to be confronted, as we all are, by a series of very high-profile, very distressing incidents of police violence in African-American communities, or in the case of Trayvon Martin, sort of vigilante violence. And obviously, or hopefully, obviously, these were very sort of grievous events that captured the nation's attention, or would capture the nation's attention in sort of brief bursts of intense interest and conversation. And then for many of us, particularly those of us who are not directly affected, or those of us who have white skin and have the sort of luxury of not being directly affected, concern, it would be a sort of ebb tide of interest. And I was sort of captured and sort of very, I guess I spent a lot of time thinking about these events. Unfortunately, there was a string of them right around the time a string of very high profile ones right around the time I was writing the last book in the last Wixom series, Trayvon Martin and Eric Garner, Staten Island, and then by the time I was writing Underground Airlines, Michael Brown was shot outside St. Louis. And every time when this sort of public conversation would well up, I became really struck, and I'm still really struck by the nature of the conversations that would be had around these events, and how very often the conversation would very quickly reduce itself to some small piece. Very often be like, what was wrong with that cop? Why would that cop do that? Or we just need body cameras. Like, oh, here's the solution, body cameras. Or in this particular case, here's the particular thing that happened. And I kept feeling, wait a second. We need to be talking about the fact that this nation was founded as a slave state. And that for 200 years, 300 years, this sort of, not just the law of the land, but the sort of organizing principle of the country is that some people were nothing, were to be bought and sold. And that didn't just go away. And it just felt, and by the way, they just came out with a study that said, like 2 weeks ago, that was like, actually, body cameras don't change anybody's behavior at all. 0%. So I guess that's what led me to this idea for the book. That led me to this moment of saying, well, I guess I as an author want to confront this notion that we are so far removed from that history. I want to ask myself and ask readers to think about how all the different ways that history still hangs over us. So I guess the reason I started by talking about The Last Policeman is that it was the combination of these two things. There's one thing going on in my professional life, this sense of who I was as an author, that I had this interest and ability in using the mystery form to get into things that mattered more to me, and then at the same time as a human, as a person walking around in my community, like asking myself, why is this happening? How can this still be our current situation, right? So many years after slavery. And so it was like, well, what do I want to do with this kind of writing I want? What do I want to think about? And I realized that what I was thinking about all the time was racism, and was the systemic racism, institutional racism, and the legacy of slavery, and the way that slavery is still so tragically present to us. And so that's how I came to what I said before, what I called before that plain metaphor of what if slavery was still real. And what I found as I wrote, and before I wrote, and as I wrote, I did a lot of research. Somebody asked me outside before, did you do any research? And I researched a ton for this book. Like The Last Policeman, and even more so in a book like this, which is so intentionally involved in American history and American present, I wanted it to feel real. It had to feel real. But so to get to that sense of reality that I hope is in the book, I read a lot. I started by reading a lot about slavery and about the history of slavery. And I could give you a syllabus, but there was a book that came out right as I started writing this called The Half Has Never Been Told by Edward Baptist. It's a new history of slavery and the way that it functioned as an economic system. And there's so many things that are so shocking and distressing, you can't believe it. But so much of our mythos or idea of slavery is about the plantation with the big house and then the slave barracks. And of course it's terrible, but it's this sort of patrilineal or patriarchal, or like the loving, or at least the sort of the family that is taking care of these people. But in fact, especially as the years of slavery went on, it was increasing. They were always looking for ways to make this system more economically effective and efficient. And so the increasing brutality of the systems, and more. Anyway, so I read books like that, and then I sort of moved into reading about the years after slavery and Reconstruction, and the ways that slavery perpetuated itself. There's a book that won the Pulitzer called Slavery by Another Name, by Douglas Blackman. It gets into the ways that of wage slavery and the ways that even former slaves were sort of re-enslaved under the thinnest of pretense, were arrested for crimes and basically put onto chain gangs, and going right back to doing the same work they had been doing under slavery. I read I'm not going to give you the whole sentence, but it's important to me. I guess it's important. Yeah, I think it's interesting, and I'm always really interested when I read a book what went into it. There's a long article by Ta-Nehisi Coates in the Atlantic called "The Case for Reparations," and he subsequently became sort of shot up in his reputation, rightfully so, for his book "Between the World and Me," and now he has a new book of essays out now. But Ta-Nehisi Coates is he's probably the best, just on a sentence level, the best essayist writing in English right now. But he's also a really deep thinker on race and just an intensely smart person. But so this book, The Case for Reparations, is about reparations. It's about this idea that America owes something to the descendants of slaves and to African Americans now, actual cash reparations. And it's an idea that people usually go, well, come on now, that's not feasible, that doesn't make any sense. But you read this article, you're like, oh yeah, totally. Because it's that thing of slavery didn't just stop. Right, that all of these, he traces all of the ways that the legacy of slavery played itself out over the decades to follow, in terms of finance, in terms of landholding, in terms of systematized housing, segregation, all this stuff. So I read. What was the point I was trying to make? I read a lot. And then as I was writing, I read more and more. And it became the thing where the initial idea for the book, and this is often the case for writing a novel, no matter what kind of book it is that you have this initial concept in your mind, and you go, oh yeah, that's really cool. I like that. And then you start writing, and usually pass through a phase where you go, no, that was terrible, what am I doing? And then you get to another place where you're like, oh, actually, here's what it really is going to be. Here's what the actual thing is. And then it gets really interesting. So I think that through a lot of that research, and as I started this book over and over and over again with a lot of different protagonists and a lot of different points of view. This book ended up in first person, but it started in third person. It started with two main characters, and then I got rid of one of them, and then I switched the other one, and then I jumped them both. And then I came to what it is. I guess I'll just say one more thing, and then I'll open it up to questions. Is that there's an obvious fact about me vis-a-vis this book, which is that I'm a white person, and that I anticipated, and as in the months leading up to the book's publication, I anticipated and was sort of that there would be pushback about me writing, not necessarily on the subject matter of the book, but particularly in the voice of the black character. The protagonist of the book is black. And I was sort of ready, and I remain ready to have that conversation. I have had that conversation with a lot of readers about artistic freedom, and also about the research I put into writing the character, and about sort of history of white authors and white artists in general representing black characters and black voices in really shitty ways, and how my sort of A1 goal in this was not to be one of those authors, and hopefully that I'm successful. And then what happened was, the book came out. There was an article about me in the New York Times, which was obviously amazing, except that the headline of the article and some of the quotes in the article, not from me, were like, Winters dares to write about slavery, to write a science fiction, to combine science fiction and slavery. And that word dares really bothered, for good reason, a lot of African American readers and writers, because there are a lot of authors before me, black authors in particular, who have written about slavery, including in science fiction contexts, who had not been put in the New York Times or sort of lauded for their daring. And so it was really interesting. Interesting wasn't the word I would have chosen that week when I was getting a lot of emails from people. It was quite upsetting. And it was upsetting because they were right, these respondents. And what was interesting to me, and that when I was able to chill out and have perspective on it and have a good conversations with people, I had written this book about systemic racism, about the ways that society very much tends to value one kind of person over another kind of people. And then when the book was published, I became an example of it. And that was really, something, you know what I mean? And what happened was, what ended up happening, I hope, is actually made a lot of really interesting relationships with people who I ended up having conversations about this with, some authors of color who I admired, who I got to meet through this strange process of the sort of public comment stuff. And it sort of like reinforced to me the overall, I guess, idea of this novel, which is that we as a sort of collective, or we as individuals, it is so easy to be unaware of things, you know, to not have that level of consciousness of how, if, you know, I as a white male author am going to be very often entitled to a certain, or receive a certain privilege and platform that if I were a black author or a woman author or a black woman author would not necessarily receive or would have to fight for more than I have. And it was sort of a useful moment for me in the coming out of, when this book came out. So I guess that's it. That's the story of the book, from concept to publication. And I guess, does anyone want to ask me anything? I know a lot of you have read the book, and now you've heard me ramble for a while.
We do have a microphone that I'll pass around just to make it easier.
Thank you. I wanted to tell you briefly that I'm teaching your novel in the context of an American history class.
Oh, that's terrific. To what age?
High school.
Awesome.
We're making a giant, I wrote you a note too, but now I don't have to give it to you.
No, I want it. I want the note.
Making a massive timeline for reality and underground airlines in African American history. From 1619 to 1860, it's one timeline, and then they diverge. Because I'm confusing the hell out of them. I mean, many of them don't know the actual history, so I wanted.
You should have seen the notes that were on my wall when I was writing the book.
Can't imagine. My kids had a bunch of questions for you, but I'm ignoring them.
God bless you.
Well, you've already answered a few of them, but I'm curious, what was the most excruciating part of the book to write? Because much of it must have been pretty painful.
The scenes of my Victor as a child, describing, and I don't actually get that into the violence that is committed against him. There's a lot of sort of illusion and sense of it, but actually just writing the conversations with his brother in the because it's so intimate and it's so sad, and you know this relationship isn't going to end well. You know what I mean? You know, because we know him as an adult, that like they're not going to be fine. You know, and so there's and those characters I came to really love is what happens or what should happen when you're writing. And so to write children and to write them in their vulnerability was quite painful. A lot of the research that I did was not only about conditions during historical slavery, but I also then read a lot about conditions now in maximum security prisons and in slaughterhouses, where, you know, the plantation where he works as a kid is a slaughterhouse. And it's gross and violent and terrible. And then I also read quite a bit about, I read a book called Escape from, I forget, but it's about the gulags in North Korea. Because I was like because a lot of the work that I did in writing the book was trying to imagine forward the conditions of historical slavery and to the present day, right? So like, and not only the economic model, like how would slavery work itself into the international global capitalism, which, by the way, was very easy to imagine. And they're actually, by the way, they're like 47 million people enslaved right now around the world. Many of them doing things like for the precious metals in our iPhones, but that's a whole other thing. Oh, but so in imagining what the conditions would be like in a slave barracks, I thought of the North Korean gulags, because there are millions of people in very primitive conditions right now in North Korea. It's unbelievable. Because this is such a tangent, I'm sorry, but like we have developed this sort of mythos of North Korea. It's like, oh, he's so funny, that crazy, and now it's getting a little more real with the, but it's really, it's a Stalinist state that absolutely uses the mechanisms of sort of communist totalitarianism to enslave people and to send them to gulags. So I read a lot about the ways that they're anyway, in creating the, trying to describe what it's like, what life was like for those kids in that slave barracks. I turned to that sort of vision. It was very hard to write because they're just kids, Yeah, well, thank you for teaching the book. I would love to see your timeline. Maybe we can take a picture. Yes.
When you wrote this, did you have a particular audience in mind that you were writing it for, or was it for a diverse audience? Was it for...
Well, I have two answers to that, and they're both... Okay, can I answer that one first? They're both kind of fast out, but I mean them both, honestly. The first answer is always, like, as an author, I wanted as big an audience. It's like, yeah, you know what I mean? Like, not only sort of the commercial, but also just because I believe in the book, and I labored on it, and I love it, and I think it's meaningful. And so my great hope was that a lot of people would read it. But honestly, white people, my answer is white people, and I say that, and it sounds so glib, but it's like, when I talk about this stuff, like, it's like, what was I saying before about how, like, we in our public conversations about police violence, we don't talk enough about the connections to historical slavery. Like, the conversations, the big public conversations are one part. Like, this conversation is going on all the time in the communities affected by it. In other words, the news that this book is bringing any news about, like, the connection between historical slavery and contemporary racism, that message is not as much news to some people as it is to other people. And so, like, I said this morning to the kids, and I feel bad dragging my mom into it, but, like, my mom read this book with her book club, and, like, just the idea of, a bunch of 60-something white Jewish ladies in Maryland, reading this and then having a conversation about systemic racism and, like, the effect of our history of slavery in our communities today that's really meaningful to me. Like, that's it. Like, if you could, like, and that's, like, part of the power for me of writing this book was, I guess as an artist, was like, I'm going to inhabit a world that is difficult for me to inhabit. I'm going to do the work required to write in a voice that is not my own voice and that is very different from my own voice. And, like, that is hard work, and, like, that's the hard work of writing, but the hard work of reading and the joy of reading is going into this landscape that is foreign from your own and asking yourself to connect and to empathize and to like be moved by something, to, like, have that make change in the way you think about the world. Like, that's a best case scenario, but that's the dream audience, is people who might otherwise not think about these issues or not think about them in a way that is meaningful or something.
Well, I was wondering, do you give this talk to maybe more of a black audience, or do you have...
Well,
how is that received, or what kind of different questions do you get? I
did a wonderful event in Indianapolis, actually, that the JCC there organized with I'm forgetting the name of it, but a local black organization. I wish I could remember this. And I was on stage with a gentleman who is a professor in Indy, and the audience was very mixed. And it was really, really wonderful. And it was interesting. I had a conversation after the event with a young woman who had been on the panel, like the panel here that chose to do the book here, had been on the panel that chose the book there, and she was a young African-American woman, and she told me, she said, I did not want to do your book. She told me, she was like, honestly, I was not happy about this selection when it was brought up. And I think it had to do with the issue of me as a white person writing this book. And then she said that she read it, and she was moved by it. And we had a really, a really powerful conversation about it. And, like, it was great. And, like, I just think so much, it's just, these things are difficult to talk about. And you can tell even as I talk to you, like, it's hard to talk about. It's easier to sit and write. And one of my I guess, one of my challenges to myself with this book is that it's important to me to keep, not that it's, it's meaningful to come out and talk to people about it, and to just encourage this sort of conversation, this ongoing conversation. So, I don't think the questions are that different. I think that there is more knowing nodding when I talk about the connection between historical slavery and contemporary racism from black audiences. I think that there are a lot of things. There was a skit on Saturday Night Live. It was the week after the presidential election. Do you remember, does anybody see this, where it was a bunch of people watching the election returns together, and it was like mostly white people, but it was like Dave Chappelle and Chris Rock, and the white people were like, oh my God, I can't believe it, Trump is winning, he's such a racist. And Dave Chappelle's like, yeah, that's why he's winning. You know what I mean? Like what is taking you guys so long to catch up to the fact that racism is a huge factor in the way this country works? Like, hello, you know? And like I will never walk down the street in this country as a black person. I will never have that experience, you know? And so I can intellectually understand that police officers often, not always, but often look at African Americans differently than they look at white people, but I'll never feel it in my bones. You know what I mean? I will never have the experience of those eyes on me in that way. And that is something that separates me from some of my fellow Americans. And if in writing a book like this, I can challenge myself to think on a deep level about what that difference is like, then I think it's valuable, at least for me. And hopefully some of that value translates to the reader, you know? Yes?
I have not a question, but a statement.
Yes.
One, I saw your picture on the back of the book, and I was like, you know what, I'm gonna read it because it's not the traditional person, because you're right. Most black people are that Dave Chappelle skit, like, why do we have to keep convincing people? Why do we have to keep proving it that these things exist? So I appreciate you speaking from that platform, because that is what, as African Americans, we're trying to say, can you even imagine what this is? You don't have to have the same experience, but can you imagine it? Can you put yourself in that place? Can you walk in that experience and have the same empathy, the human empathy for that experience? And so that is, I read it because when I flipped it over, you weren't what I thought I was going to do. And I appreciate you for your honesty and your openness to talk about it.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Hi. In your opening statement, you were reading your book about him being in the city, bringing all of his stuff, and then he talked about who was going to pull him over, the state trooper, the whatever.
Yeah.
He knew it was going to happen, and he said, I submitted, right? Nothing's changed. You know what I mean? Nothing's changed. If you are a black man especially, and you get pulled over, you just have to go with it. Even though in your gut you know you're mad, you have to submit.
Yeah, that's why I've described this novel as an alternate reality. It's not alternate enough, right? It's interesting, and that's another experience I think about a lot. I just described how I'll never walk down the street, as a black person in this country, but I have kids, and that. What's been described to me by black friends, or what we hear in the media about a talk that black parents feel they need to have with their kids, saying, well, here's how you have to behave if you are, if you fall under the authority of the police. Like the fact that I don't have to have that conversation with my kids, I can feel, is heartbreaking. And by the way, as an author, this is a literary term, it's dystopian. And I think that the idea that there are some people in a society who have a very different relationship from constituted police authority from other people, right, and is dystopian. And by the way, if you were going to set up a dystopian novel, saying, well, there's this guy who wrote the founding document of this, imagine there's this country, and there's this man who wrote the founding document, right, subscribing that country to an ideal of liberty and equality for all men. But get this, he owns people. And not only does he own people, he's systematically raping one of them and starting a family with them and not telling anybody. That's dystopian. And by the way, I love this country. And I'm honored to live here. And there's nowhere else in the world I want to live. And I believe in the ideals of this country. And I don't want to come off as being like this country is poisoned at the root. Because I understand that there are many, many wonderful things about this country. And we are lucky to live here. And I believe in freedom. And I believe in I'm everything, the bicameral legislature, I love it. Like, freedom of the press, all of that. But I think that we overlook, we ignore our flaws very much at our peril, Start giving me your cardio here.
I was intrigued by the Garments of the Greater South. That was such an amazing corporation and so believable in terms of, that was
International global economy.
Yeah, and they were textiles, and it occurred to me that in this country, I don't think we produce that much. Much of our clothing comes from...
Most of it comes from overseas.
And those people aren't being paid much, and the only way in this, they're making all these profits, and it's because people aren't being paid anything.
Yes, and there was a very, it was a high-profile incident in Bangladesh. I think it was in 2012 or 2011, where a factory collapsed and hundreds of people died. And they came to investigate, and they're like, oh, well, first of all, these people were being paid nothing. And secondly, there were no fire alarms, and the doors were locked from the outside. And it's the kind of industrial accident that we had in this country in the early 1900s, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, that's something like. So we have outsourced slavery in a way. And so that the Garments of the Greater South, the idea that I create in the book of the mega plantation where it's all done on site, they grow the cotton, they pick the cotton, they process it, was definitely an artistic sort of imagining of what these systems would look like if we didn't have to outsource them anymore. And one of the things that when people talk about the Civil War, we can talk about General John Kelly and Robert E. Lee if you want, but one of the things people talk about when they talk about how, it's just a shame. The whole thing's just a shame, the Civil War, because if we had just found a way, and people talk about how, eventually, people love to, contrarian historians like to say that eventually slavery would have petered out. That it was unnecessary to have that war because eventually slavery would have ended, which is capital B, capital S. And you've got to read this book, The Half Has Not Been Told, because he talks about how with every generation of slavery, the slave owner, the slave-owning class was figuring out new ways to make slavery more efficient, not less. And then people I guess, once you have convinced yourself morally that this is okay, there's no way that you're going to give up the economic benefit of it without fighting. And that's what that war is about. And even just saying that it would have lasted for another 30 years, millions of people would have died in that time, and suffered, and been born and died in chains. Like, any argument, for the honor, if writing this book taught me anything, it is that any argument for the honor of Southern generals in the Civil War is an insult to the United States of America. And something I think was really profound that Ta-Nehisi Coates, who I mentioned earlier, pointed out after that set of statements. You guys know what I'm talking about. General Kelly mentioned on television.
And the compromise.
That there should have been, that Civil War could have been averted by compromise. That point of view, that opinion, that it completely negates all of the black Americans, that there were people in this country that time. That if you basically, what the argument is that, well, a lot of people in the South at that time, we have to respect our heritage. Those are Americans too. Well, so were the millions of people who were slaves then. Those were Americans too. So anyway, I could talk about that for a long time. I've been really interested, for obvious reasons, since I wrote this book, in all of these conversations about Confederate monuments and about our heritage and about how we have to respect our heritage. It's as if in Germany right now there were statues of Nazis everywhere. It really is. But Robert E. Lee took up arms against the United States of America. Like, his contribution to American history was trying to end it. Like, that's what we need to say to people. And John Kelly's from Boston, by the way. He's from Boston. He's not from the South.
Hi.
Hi.
Welcome. Just kind of piggybacking on what you said, did you watch the Netflix documentary 19? It's about the prison industrial complex.
The 13th, yes.
13th.
I did not. I read a lot about it, but I did.
So many similarities in your book, and I thought maybe that was where you...
No, but I think that I'm sure that many of Ava DuVernay made that movie. I think many of the things that she talks about in there I read a lot about in other sources, but yes.
Okay, and on a lighter note, Brighton, Michigan. Brightmore.
Yeah.
Pick it out of a hat?
More or less, not exactly. It's just detail work. Like when you're creating a character, you want to know where they're from, and especially in a mystery, the more that you can sort of pin a character to a map. And I guess I just did some research and found a neighborhood that sounded like a place where he would be from. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I know that now. Yeah, the only place in the book that has any actual connection to me is Côte Saint-Luc, which is a suburb of Montreal, which is where they talk about in the book where many escaped slaves end up going to Côte Saint-Luc, and that's where my grandmother lived. That's where my mom grew up, in Montreal. And so my grandmother lived there. There's a big Jewish immigrant community in Montreal and in Côte Saint-Luc, and that's why. But everything else is just...
Yeah, I have a detailed question about your choice to include the pigment color numbers. Where you got that idea to do that, and why you decided it was important to include it?
I have to tell you something. That idea about the pigment colors, I get that everybody is struck by that. For some reason, it's like the most shocking / striking thing in the book. Everyone is like, and I'm not sure why I did. I guess it was, well, obviously our nation has a problem with skin color, right? And I think it goes beyond just black and white, but I think even if you ask within African American communities, there's often an internal bias or racism amongst people with darker, lighter skin. I think like we're always fascinated or obsessed with like Michael Jackson changing his skin color. What does that mean? Or like, and I guess it was a grafting of that aspect of America's racial issues onto my larger premise, which is that this is a detective novel. This is a novel about forensic investigation, and it's a manhunter story, right? So if you are going to be tracking people based, trying to find them, one element is going to be their skin color. So it was just a way of description that they were very employing. So I guess that's where it came from. But for whatever reason, it's really hit on people. Like it's just something that people really notice and are interested in, which I think is interesting.
We're going to take one more question.
Mine's getting old.
Okay, I'm going to keep it on this side. It's easier.
Just throw the mic over.
Right?
Hi. So you had said before, well, I want to hear about what it was like when you heard the amazing voice of William Demerit.
On the audiobook?
Oh my God.
Yeah, does anyone else listen to the audiobook?
Oh my God.
Yeah, he's great.
Oh my God.
So here's the thing about audiobooks, is that I'm going to tell him. We've been kept in touch, me and Will Demerit. He's great. He's killer. So you as an author have no real say over who narrates the audiobook. It's one of those things like the cover, where you're like, you think when you're a kid, you're like, I can't wait to be an author because I'm going to draw the cover, you know what I mean? But then one day they just send you a PDF, they're like, here's the cover, more or less. But the audiobook, it's kind of similar. But they sent me at some point, they're like, here are the 4 finalists, and they'd each read a section. I was like, that's the guy. And they picked him. And yeah, he's amazing. And the thing about the book, and that as an audiobook in particular, is that the character is himself an actor, right? So he does a lot of different voices and personas. And again, this is sort of a topic in terms of American race relations, this idea of code switching, right? That like this idea that many black people often feel that when they are in a sort of white milieu, perhaps at work or among white friends, they speak in a certain way, whereas when they're in a black milieu, they feel more comfortable speaking a black way, quote unquote. And Bill and I talked a lot about that in terms of his performance of the book. That's actually something that when I was researching that, I got really interested in, because there's this interesting intersection between the concept of code switching and detective novels in general, and the undercover operative. And then if you read a book like Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, which you should, it's a masterpiece, it's an American novel, but that character as a black person feels he essentially has to live undercover as an American, constantly shifting his identity. And so actually, I can't go ahead and say this before, that novel, Invisible Man, I read it and I was like, oh my God, this is like a mystery novel. This is a character who has to shapeshift to survive. And something about that and the idea of having to live undercover sort of helped to inspire this character and the way that he, by profession, has to live undercover, but he is also in a constant process of hiding his own identity from himself. person, which is a big challenge if you're an audiobook narrator, and he totally nailed it. I've been asking for years to narrate my own audiobooks, but for this one I was like, nope. I'm going to steer clear on this one. Yeah.
So at this time then, I want to thank you, one, for, I think, writing a fabulous book and giving the library and the libraries in our community an opportunity to have an amazing conversation beyond tonight, but also, to allow us to think a little differently. Libraries are really trying to do that these days. We are trying to get communities together so that we can have those courageous conversations, and you, by this book, have allowed us to do that this evening. So thank you so much.
Thank you all very much.
We're going to let Ben walk out first, just so he can get away from the crowd for a minute. He's here, ladies and gentlemen, he will be here this evening for a good hour or so. We have wine poured. You all have a ticket, so you're all welcome to a glass of wine. We have cider and water as well, cookies, desserts from Stephen Rocky's, and it has been a pleasure to serve all of you and provide a program this evening to all of you. Thank you for supporting our 6 libraries, and enjoy your evening. Thank you.